can start. We have, and I think appropriate of delay. What's important for me, literally speaking, not to start punctual, because it can be very dangerous. And so, welcome to the last day, last two sessions. This morning, the session of this morning is a little bit of an experiment, I would say, in many senses, both because I try to bring at the table also people who are working on different areas than South Asia. So we have an exotic specimen of Talmud scholar and classicist, and we have an expert on Italian medieval liturgy. I hope I described you right, Andrew. But also it's an experiment in the sense that I wanted to see if we could to think together at irony, not in terms also of in some sense in terms of rhythm, so in terms of dissonance and expectation. So the title of this panel that might seem a little bit unexpected or not so clear, syncopating God without missing a beat, and syncopating God without missing a beat. And the second part, the ironic, joking part, I have to thank Dish for producing the joke from a native speaker. Syncopating God is all my fault and my responsibility. The idea was to, so to say, to syncopate in the sense, of course, in musical terms, is when the rhythm is, so to say, the strong beat is not where expected, so it creates a kind of counter time, controtempo, but it's also used, for example, in when it comes to language, when a word is shortened. So the idea is either of displacement or of loss of one or more sounds. So this idea of not addition but subtraction that you were addressing, Alessandro, and permutation is displacement. So my idea was to look at how, especially in the field of, so to say, religious practices or religious discourse, irony can be linked, or we can think of irony in broader terms as a form of so to say, dissonance, a way to play with the expectation of the audience, to displace something that, so to say, is of course then related or implies a kind of norm, but the norm is not exactly broken, it's just slightly changed. So this idea of not exactly just you know, irony often is thought of in terms of breaking the norms, a way of challenging the norms, and or as a way to re-establish the norm through a kind of cathartic process. It seems to be the two main interpretative paths. So here I wanted to see if it's possible to think of something in between, so to say, or more nuanced. And so the norm is not exactly challenged, it's just a little bit shaken, a little bit made a little bit more blurred. And what happens when something like that happens is so to say, practiced or created in a religious discourse. So I think I've spoken enough. and I hope I've confused you enough, so I can give the stage, so to say, to Yakir, that will make everything much more clear in time.
Okay, so thank you very much, Elena and Flor, for organizing this conference. And I'm really one of the only two non-Indologists, I think, in this conference, but it's still been very interesting. And I've, that as Elena needed about 5-10 minutes to explain the title of the session, so I wasn't completely sure. I tried to kind of think how to do it, but luckily I'm on the third day, so I've already heard other talks, and we'll try and pick up certain things. And what I will try and do here is take a story which I've been working on and look at it from the point of view kind of irony, sarcasm, or kind of also tapping into what Elisa was talking about, bringing it in the context of polemic. And I will try here to read a story, to read the story, which I think is funny, but to try and see how the different levels of this within the story, the audience within the story, the audience from without, and then eventually taking this text actually more seriously than it seems to be taken, and then in a way, hopefully we can kind of turn it on its head and show that actually we can go that this text is actually, without being aware, ironic. So I will read the main text. At this handout, we're not going to go obviously over all the sources, just for those who are interested. So the text which we'll be reading is from the Babylonian Talmud, which was edited around the 6th century CE in modern day Iraq. And it's a polemic between the emperor, Caesar, and Rabban Gamliel. So these are characters from the 2nd century CE, but this is obviously not an authentic dialogue, and very clearly also kind of elaborated over the centuries. So it's most probably by now a 5th or 6th century text. And so let's just read it, and then I'll explain. So the emperor said to Rabban Gamliel, "He who created mountains did not create wind, and he who created wind did not create mountains." And it says, citing Amos, "Behold, he who formed the mountains and created the wind." But now it is written regarding Adam, and he created, in Genesis 1:27, and he formed, Genesis 2:7. Here too, he who created this did not create this. There is a handbreadth by a handbreadth in the human body, and 2 cavities are in the human body. He who created this did not create this. For it says, "Shall he who implants the ear not hear? He who forms the eye not see? He who created the ear did not create the eye." The emperor said to him, "Yes." Rabban Gamliel said to him, "And at the time of death are they all appeased." So let's just go through the story to see. So at the beginning of the story, the emperor suggests that the power which created the mountains did not create the wind, and based on 2 different verbs used. So each verb, so according to the reading technique the emperor offers, each verb does not only reflect a different action, but a different actor. So supposedly, since the verse says, "He who created, the one who created the wind and formed the wind, created the mountains and formed the wind," these are 2 verbs, so these are 2 actors. Possibly also, could also be mountains and wind, could also be material and like spiritual. So Rabban Gamliel picks up the technique and applies it to Genesis, to the creation of man, where we have 2 different verbs in chapter 1 and 2. So he is implying that more than one, which implies more than one creator, or more than one power involved in the creation of man. Rabban Gamliel doesn't wait for an answer, so he takes this. So he's implementing the reading technique of the emperor, and he goes on, and he goes a step further, citing Psalms 94, where 2 different verbs are used for the creation of the eye and the ear. Implementing the same mode of reading used by his adversary would lead to the inevitable and absurd and maybe even funny or ridiculous conclusion in Rabban Gamliel's eye, and also I think in the original reader's eye, that one power created the ear, while another power created the eye. So I think both in the verse you have the eye and the ear with 2 different verbs, but I think it's also supposed to kind of exaggerate how ridiculous this kind of reading technique is, because in 2 little, the ear and the eye are so close, how can there be 2 powers? And it would also imply that other powers created other body members, since man's body is not made up solely from an ear and an eye. And here there's a surprise, because the emperor candidly agrees, or maybe takes the bait. He says, yes, that there were different creators created. One created the eye, one created the ear. And previous scholars have regarded this stage already as an exaggeration, meaning that the emperor has already, this is just by the fact that they said the eye, and he says, yes, this doesn't reflect any real opinion. We are already in the realm of the comic or the parody of these kind of crazy reading techniques. However, I would like to show that which should be taken as a real serious proposition. So based on the emperor's consent that the different powers created different body members, Rabban Gamliel drives in the final nail, which is, if different powers were involved in the creation of man, that would mean that in order for one to die, all these powers will have to be appeased, meaning they'll have to consent. And this, I think, is also a kind of humoristic stage of this, like imagining all these multitude of creators who each control a body part, and in order for someone to die, they all have to agree. But instead, he seems to have this idea that these are quarrelsome gods who just can't agree about anything. And so the fact that someone dies means you can't have many creators. It is also crucial to note that Rabban Gamliel's final answer assumes that every power retains control over the body member it created, for only that would lead to the conclusion that death would have to be a result of an agreement between different powers. So this is kind of the overview of the story. So most scholars take it as just, kind of a funny story. This can't really be an opinion. This can't really be a coherent idea. Now, I would like to actually take all the things the emperor says seriously, and try and kind of recreate or a specific doctrine which would help us. And so on the one hand, it will help us understand the story, but on the other, as I like to show, it will actually flip the story and go against what Rabban Gamliel thought he had triumphantly kind of given the last word. So just the assumptions which undergird the emperor's theological worldview could be summed up as follows. So first thing, there's a literal reading of the Bible. So it doesn't know metaphors. Different powers created the world. And the literal reading is also that you take there's no synonym. So if there are two verbs of creation, that's two actors. And there's two different creations of man by different creators. Each body member was created by a different creator, in particular the ear and the eye. And the creation of a body part by a power also establishes a continuous connection between them. So we can find some discrete elements in different sources, but I would like to show that the combination is actually unique and points to a very specific religious group. And I think that will, as I say, will kind of de-ironize or kind of flip this whole story around. So I want to first shortly go over some of these specific arguments and see how they come together. So the first is what I call the polydemiurgism, which is this idea of many creators. And the idea that the world was created by different powers appears in many sources in late antiquity. Such ideas, for example, are also presented in a Jewish text in Genesis Rabbah, where heretics ask this rabbi and they say, how many gods created the world? And they say to him, why is it written in the beginning, Elohim created? And Elohim in Hebrew is plural. So these are heretics which are presented as saying that the world was created. And indeed, many other figures which we have in antiquity speak about a lot of creators involved in the creation of the world. And also we find that in Plato. The second thing is what we can call the differentiation between the psychic and somatic Adam, meaning between the psychic aspect and the material aspect of the creation of Adam. And this is already, we know from Philo, as a Hellenistic Jew of the 1st century CE, and we distinguishes systematically between the creation of man in chapter 1 of Genesis, which is the psychic creation, in chapter 2. And following Plato's Timaeus, he distinguishes between creation of these two, and you can see that, I'm not going to read, but you can see it in source number 6. And this again is found elsewhere. So the fact that based on the verbs, because when it talks about molding in chapter 2 and chapter 1 speaks about creation, based on these verbs, we we already find in earlier sources that indeed, because of these versions of the two different creations and possibly also two different creators. The idea that several powers created the body is based on, again, the plural verb, which it says, let us make man in our image. So the Na'aseh Adam Ketzalmenu, which we find in chapter 1 of Genesis. And Philo interprets this in light of Plato's description in the Timaeus of the younger gods who created the human frame. And he says, let's say Philo says, you can see it in your source, he states that God said, let us make, which reveals the enlistment of other collaborators. And we find that also opinions in rabbinic literature and in other sources. However, in almost all these sources which deal with the creation of the body by multiple powers, a very fundamental and practical question is not addressed. So how do these powers collaborate in creation of the body? What was the division of labor? It seems like, again, this was kind of a joke in the story, in our story, but it's a serious question. Did they all create the body together, as Plato seems to, or did they each power have a particular assignment? So I'll return to that point. But now to another element of the story. As mentioned earlier, the final answer of Rabban Gamliel points to the implicit assumption that each creator continues to control the body part which he created. So not only did the one who created ear created, but since the answer at the end is that everybody has to agree, it means that the power which created the ear controls the ear, and so it's not just the creator, it has an influence. So the ascriptions of heavenly powers to specific body members is known as melothesia, from melos in Greek, part or body member, and thesis or placing. And it's also known as an astrological medicine or gastrology. The common forms of the division of the body according to the zodiac into 12 planets, 7 deacons, it's an Egyptian term of 36, or a combination. This already we know goes back at least to the 2nd century BC. It is Greek, but we already find it in Mesopotamian sources. A clear presentation of the zodiacal melothesia, meaning the idea that the zodiac is responsible, and this is not creation, this is connection. And we can find in a source of Firmitius Maternus, which is from the 4th century. That's source number 8 on your handout, and I'll just read one part. He says, all parts of the human body are divided among the signs, so the signs of the zodiac. Ptolemy's planetary melothesia includes assigning certain planets to the eyes and the ears even. So if you see source number 9 on your handout, he says Saturn is the lord of the right ear, the spleen, the bladder, the phlegm, and so on. Mars of the left ear, kidneys, veins, genitals, the sun of the sight, the brain, heart, and so on. So why do specific heavenly powers influence the control of specific body parts? So melothesia is based on what David Pingree has formulated a natural sympathy between macrocosmos and microcosmos. That is an analogical relation between man and universe. However, according to the emperor in the Babylonian Talmud, the control of body parts seems to be related to the creation. So melothesia is not based, the idea of correspondence between what we call, you can see also I gave like you have a picture on your final page here of what we call the zodiac man. You find in various the different astrological signs which control different body parts. So the idea there is of correspondence, not of creation. So, but in our story, we have this assumption that they were also created. So this connection between astrology and creation is very rare. I mean, it's found in one text or in a couple of texts. One of them, who is the Apocryphon of John, and which was originally composed in Greek, probably as early as the 2nd century CE, but it's come down to us only in Coptic in the Nag Hammadi library, and it survives in 2 versions, the longer version and the shorter version. And this is here on source number 13, which I've put one part of the longer and the short. So the creation of man in the Apocryphon of John is described as follows. they said to each other, different powers, let us create man in the image of God and his the likeness. And they created out of each other and all their powers. And then it goes on, they molded from out of themselves in each one of the powers, and they created the soul, they created the image, which they have seen by imitating the one who is at the beginning, the perfect man. So this is a creation by looking up and imitating the body part. And they said, let us call him Adam, and so on. And then the powers began from below. So this is now creation. So first is these are the different names of the powers. The divinity, so it created the bone soul. The second, goodness, created the sinew soul, and the flesh soul, blood soul, skin soul, hair soul. And they ordered the whole body, and the angels attended from the things first prepared by the authorities. They created the substance of the soul, the harmony of the joint limbs. So here we have a creation. So as a scholar, as Dr. Plescher noted, the author of the Apocryphon of John takes two Genesis accounts of the creation of man, not as variants, but as two consecutive moments in the cosmogony. While Genesis 1:26-7 refers to the creation of Adam's animate body, Genesis 2:7 describes the formation of the empirical fleshy man. But here we actually are seeing the creation of the kind of psychic aspect. Van der Broek has clearly shown that the 7 powers here correspond to the 7 planets. In addition, he was the first to point out the division into 7 successive layers of the body, bone, sinew, flesh, marrow, and oil, goes back to Plato's description in the Timaeus of the creation of the somatic body by the younger gods. However, Plato does not connect the 7 substances to the planets. This combination is derived probably from an astrological treatise which contained this very particular planetary melothesia, but which has not come down to us. And here's my one gesture to Sanskrit. It's based on its adaptation by Middle Persian source and a direct translation into Sanskrit in the Yavana Jataka, which might go back early as the 2nd century. We can conclude that the original Greek treatise was most probably composed not later than the 1st century CE, probably in Alexandria, which again combining these things. The author, as the Apocryphon of John, as Plescher notes, skillfully combined Moses, Genesis, Plato, which has a psychic and somatic Adam, and a particular version of Greek planetary melothesia. This creates a relatively unique and detailed description of creation of man, which I call melothesian anthropogony. So where we have this kind of correspondence between various planets, but the connection is based on creation. That is, unlike the classical idea that melothesia is based on an analogy or sympathy, here the relation between celestial powers and the body parts is established by the direct involvement of these powers in the creation of the body. In the short version of the Apocryphon of John, after the creation of the psychic body, the creation of the somatic body is briefly mentioned. However, in the longer version, you can see this on page 4. In the longer version, a very detailed description of the creation of the body parts follows. I'll just read the first one created the head, and then Astrecheme created the right eye, then another the left eye, and the right ear and the left ear. And the list goes on to detail 72 members of Adam's body. And as Quack has convincingly shown, the names are all Egyptian origin, and the number 72 represents a version of what we call a decanic melothesia. And the text concludes, this is the number of the angels. Together there were 365. They all worked on it until limb for limb, the natural and material body was composed by them. Now there are other ones in charge of remaining passions who did not mention. And so we have here the creation of the body by different powers, including, surprisingly, so it's not a joke, the ear and the eye. So unlike the planetary creation, which described the creation of a psychic body, 7 substances, here we have a detailed and unique description of each creation of each body member. And it's based, as we can see, on both the Bible, Plato, and Greek and Egyptian astrology, and includes almost all the arguments which were put forward by the emperor. We could have stopped here and say that this is more or less what the Babylon Talmud is arguing against, but there are a few problems. First, we lack an explicit use of extreme literalism. And also the deities are portrayed very negatively. And also, how would this be known to the Jews in Babylonia? This is a text which we find in Egypt. So I believe that the answer here lies in a sect which is called the Aldeans. So I'll go shortly through this. So Aldi was active in the first half of the 4th century, was a native of Edessa, Syria, and served also as an archdeacon. According to Epiphanius of Salamis, 4th century, this is, you can see in source 14, the Aldeans were schismatics, they weren't heretics. He praises Aldi elsewhere, stating that his whole manner of life was admirable, so there was no problem in the way he was acting. And he continues, but they make an immoderate use of a number of apocryphal works. They do not pray with us because they find fault with our bishops and call some of them rich and others other things. And I skip, besides, they have some ignorant, contentious ideas and interpret our creation in God's image with extreme literalness. And he goes on in the Panarion, another work of his. Epiphanius elaborates on Audi's reading method and its outcome. And he says, for he, and this is at the bottom of page 5, for he and his adherents stubbornly declare that the gift God granted Adam of being in his image applies to his body, supposedly because of a literal wording of let us make man in our image and after our likeness. And then the word of God adds, and God took dust and earth and made man. Since scripture has said that God made man from earth, says Aldius, see how it is said with perfect truth that the entire earthly part is man. Therefore, it says earlier that the earthly part of man will itself be the image of God. So the actual physical body of man is in the image of God, not just the spiritual aspect, the psychic aspect. So he has a very extreme version of anthropomorphism, or actually it's theomorphism, according to which God is a physical and visible body, composite of bodily movements. Later, Epiphanius comments, but the Aldeans cite certain other texts as well. They say the eyes of the Lord look upon the poor and his ears are open upon the prayer. So God has eyes and God has ears. So this is already the first stage. We can already see that Aldi has kind of, so this idea again of different creators based on a very literal reading of the text already exists. Our most important source about the Mesopotamian Aldeans comes from Theodore Balkoni, who was the bishop of Kashgar in southern Iraq in the second half of the 8th century. And the first part of his description is based on Epiphanius, but then he has another source, and he seems to be drawing from a Syriac heresiology, maybe even direct knowledge, to reflect some later development of the Aldeans, and this you can see on the sources, the Syriac sources on page 7. So I'll just go quickly. So he accepts the Old and New Testament. He asserts that light and darkness were not created. And he taught that God was composite and possessed all respects the appearance of a human being. And he thinks the following of the verses. So he actually does address the verses of Genesis. So the use of different nouns or verbs actually relate kind of the manifestations and activities. And then he brings the kind of he cites different sources and compares, we can see the different verbs of creation. And it says further, they ask who compelled the angels and powers to form the body? And in the Apocalypse attributed to John, which is clearly the Apocryphon of John. So the Aldeans at a certain point adopt that very text. So, they have this text, and then my wisdom created flesh, understanding created skin, Adonai created nerves, envy created hair, and so on. So similar to Epiphanius, Balkoni points to the Aldeans' anthropomorphism, which was based on a literal reading of scripture. And then we can also very clearly distinguishes between the verbs of molding and forming between Genesis 1 and 2. So Aldi or the Aldeans have a very literal reading of the Bible. And it's possible, even though I think it's likely that they had the longer version of the Apocryphon of John, meaning they also had the ears and the eyes. So I would argue that the Aldeans here didn't necessarily also regard the creators as evil, they seem to have referred to 7 powers who created as the holy creator. So it's not negative so much as the Gnostic text. So I would argue that the audience literal reading of the Bible and the belief that God is composite and corporal led to them to adopting extracts from various books, which highlighted the creation of man by different divinities. And they understood the creation to be in the corporal image of God. So each power looked at the body part and copied it down. And that's, for example, one creator looked at God's eye and created an eye, and one looked at God's ear and created an ear. And this creation established an enduring connection between that power and the body part. So it could be called maybe in a theomorphic, Melophysian anthropology, so putting it all together. And all based on a very literal reading. So we can see that all the elements we talked about are in the audience version, so the literal reading of so everything the emperor says, which seemed to be a joke, it's actually not so funny. So we have someone who has literal reading of the Bible, very different powers created the world, 2 different creations of man, multiple creators of the body, including the ear and the eye. And the creation of the body part establishes a continuous connection. So at this stage, we can we can see that actually what this text seems to be to kind of make a fool out of the emperor and keep pushing him to more extremes. And very clearly, both maybe the person who's recounting, but different, the audience would say, well, this is very funny. Who would even imagine that this kind of an idea? But I would like to take now the final step and kind of undermine the whole story and kind of undermine the supposed coup de grace of Rabban Gamliel, which is like, at the time of death, they will all be appeased, which seems to kind of make, it's funny. It's obviously gods can't actually collaborate. So actually, we need to think that the ideas concerning the body are often a blueprint for the understanding of the body politic. So a classical approach to the body, and hence the church is articulated by Paul in 1 Corinthians 12, who claims that the body is comprised of dependent parts in a hierarchical structure. So Paul states, for example, and if the ear would say, because I am not the eye, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. I would argue that it's possible that the audience fragmentation of the body into independent members, each controlled by a different positive power, stand in opposition to such classical visions of the body and the body politic based on hierarchy and dependence. It is worth recalling that Audi is reported to have severely critiqued the priest's corruption, accumulation of wealth and abuse of power. That's part of what Epiphanius says, that actually he has nothing bad to say about Audi because he was actually against this abuse of power. His departure from the church was thus fore and foremost based on moral and political rather than theological grounds. It is possible that such a worldview led him or his followers to adopt the specific account of the creation of man's body. The audience political vision would thus be one in which life and death is a matter of constant collaboration between independent and equal members of the body politic, each creating the corporal image of God. Indeed, I believe that to the final and supposedly triumphant and supposedly also ironic or sarcastic or parodic question of Rabban Gamliel, who asks, and at the time of death, they are all appeased, I think that his opponent would once again just simply answer yes. So that's the...
Well, thank you, Eleanor. It's an honor to be invited to participate in this conference as certainly an outsider, but an admirer. And I must say, it's no exaggeration that I have felt myself often in awe of what you all are doing. Of course, there's a little bit of exoticism in that. I'm not inside the field, but I've learned a lot, as much as I can in the last 2 days. The title of the present reflections suggests an apparent oxymoron. If instructions, ritual or otherwise, are intended to prompt a certain sequence of actions and effects, it would seem to stand to reason that it would not only be perverse, but inherently self-contradictory for them to be intended ironically, that is, in a manner contrary to what the words actually say, as Quintilian famously put it. We are perhaps familiar with everyday ironic optative imperatives, the kind of "have a nice day" that we might encounter from an exasperated shop attendant, sarcastically wishing in a telling but not too telling tone to an overly demanding customer that they should get out of the shop. Or the aggressively ironic well-wishing of the kind offensively parodied in the lyrics of Mr. Garrison's Christmas song in South Park. We may have even shared a family joke that suggests, for example, that the elderly aunt from whom one stands to inherit a fortune should take care going down those slippery stairs when she's invited home for Christmas. And since David Wegner's work on what he dubbed the ironic process theory in the 1990s, the tendency of certain mental imperatives of avoidance or suppression to lead, in fact, to the opposite effect is no longer simply the topic of literary trope or spiritual counsel, but the subject of serious psychological research. But the practical, the step-by-step instructions about how to do something of the kind found in recipe books, in DIY manuals, and in liturgical manuscripts, though they may be parodied, would seem to be impervious to irony. In the following minutes, I will attempt, however, to argue the opposite. Taking a single example of a complex processional ritual described in an early 10th century monastic manuscript from Christian southern Italy, I wish to explore how a series of curious additions to rubrical instructions may be best understood as a kind of highly creative, ironic strategy, not to provoke a gag, but to articulate grief and to reconstitute an epistemic community after an episode of devastating violence and destruction. We shall proceed in 3 steps. First, we need to be introduced to the manuscript context of the ritual description. Second, an account of the ritual procession in broad outline will lead to a detailed consideration of 2 curiously out-of-place additions to the rubrical instructions. We will conclude, thirdly, and perhaps most experimentally, if not to say foolhardy, with some open considerations of the additions to the rubrics in light of theories of irony. So, the manuscript context. The ritual instructions in question appear in a manuscript copied in the early 10th century, apparently at the order of Abbot John. You see here on the right is Abbot of Monte Cassino 915 to 934, and here he is presenting his book to the abbey's patron, St. Benedict. Significantly, this means that the manuscript was prepared while the Cassinese community was not at Monte Cassino, but in exile at Capua, following the destruction of the community's 2 principal monasteries at Cassino during Arab raids in 883. The monks would not return to Monte Cassino until the middle of the 10th century. We shall have cause to return to this detail. The volume of modest dimensions constitutes a veritable compendium or dossier of the abbey's history, law, and custom, containing no fewer than 16 independent texts. It opens with a copy of the all-important monastic rule of Benedict, accompanied by a commentary of Hildemar of Corbie, here attributed to local boy Paul the Deacon. And they follow monastic capitularies, custom-informing letters, ordines describing Cassinese liturgical customs, including our own ordo, highlighted here in blue. A group of 3 historical texts known collectively as the Chronicae Sancti Benedicti that describe the early history of the abbey and of the region, a list of liturgical readings for use in the Church of Rome, a list of the counts of Capua, an epitaph in praise of Paul the Deacon, a document describing the division of the Principate of Benevento from that of Salerno, which ended a bitter civil war, an order for the celebration of Easter, and an epitaph in praise of another Cassinese abbot, Abbot Allegone. The index has attracted considerable scholarly attention, particularly in the wake of an influential book and article by the medieval historian Walter Pohl, who lent it a prominent role in what he described, with more than a wink to Derrida, as the construction of the Lombard past. For Paul, the scribes' reworking of the 9th century material in the early 10th century constitutes a primary example of the politics of memory, as the community in exile sought to refashion its identity by dint of collecting and editing fragments of its past, in what the Austrian historian calls Werkstätte der Erinnerung, memory ateliers. Some scholars have questioned Paul's interpretation of the volume, but that need not delay us here. What is worth noting, however, is that at least one of the group of the 3 chronicle texts contained in the manuscript, and contained here alone, is notably characterized by the use of irony. The second part of the chronicle, which comprises a narrative of the period between the murder of the Prince of Benevento in 839 and the 860s, centers on events around Monte Cassino and its area, its property. It is written, the author tells us, to explain rather darkly the reason for Muslim victories in the Principality of Benevento in this period. Here is an example of the kind of situational irony that this author appears to enjoy. He writes, for instance, that a certain Lombard official by the name of Rodoald built a fortress near Pontecorvo and refused to accept the overlordship of the Capuans. When the Capuans started to threaten him, he sent word by a priest to a certain Frankish cleric in the area by the name of Maginulf, who had married none other than the niece of the empress, and who, we are told, was looking for a place to stay, perhaps on his way back to France. Rodoald invited the Frank to lodge with him, such southern Italian hospitality, and thereby to support him against his pesky Capuan overlords. Maginulf was clearly a force to be reckoned with, and this was precisely what the Pontecorvan pretender had failed to do. Shortly after his arrival, Maginulf imprisoned his Lombard host, threw his sons in the tower, stole all his property, treasure, animals, slaves, serfs, people, the castle and villa, and put them all under his own control. Moreover, the Frank taught the local Pontecorvans, who until then, the chronicler tells us, knew nothing but onions and garlic, to pay him both rent and military service. Now, the story is attributed by the ironic moral of the story is attributed by the chronicler to Aesop. This kind of thing, that the man invited in to protect ends up being the opposite of a protector but an enemy, happens to those who invite into their homes someone stronger than they are, he says. In this context, an allusion to the unintended, or we might say ironic effects of Lombard princes inviting in Muslim mercenaries to fight their own battles seems pretty clear. Indeed, in the preceding paragraph, we have Soldan being recorded, who's the emir of Bari at the time, who's recorded as being amused at the fighting between the Capuans and the Neapolitans, while the chronicler piously records the defeat of the Neapolitans who had dared to challenge the Capuans' forces, who were protected after all by the Archangel Michael. He also notes that the Muslim emir scoffed. Tow or flax or hemp and padding have gotten together to make a war, he says. The inflated significance of cosmic battles fought on the local stage, religiously noted by the chronicler, the battles between the Neapolitans and the Capuans, is therefore forcefully undercut by the chronicler's own quotation of the Muslim emir. And the irony leaves the reader in little doubt as to who has real political power, at least at this particular moment in the troubled history of the Mezzogiorno in the mid-9th century. Let's get to the procession I promised. The set of instructions describing the annual ritual customs of the monks of Monte Cassino appears immediately before the opening of those chronicles we were just discussing in the manuscript. And the procession ritual with which we are concerned is the most elaborately described liturgical ritual of all the customs there recorded. The procession is prescribed for Easter Tuesday, and in broad outline proceeded as follows. The abbot and monks from the monastery at the top of the mount were to process with candles, banners, relics, and gospel books down the hill, while monks from the monastery at the bottom of the hill, dedicated to the Saviour, the administrative hub of the two monastery unit, were simultaneously to make their way up to a third church located in the ruins of the Roman town of Cassinum. There they greeted each other ceremonially, Mass was to be begun, and then the communities would head down to the lower monastery again, singing as they went. At this lower church, Mass would be celebrated solemnly, and then everyone would head to the refectory for a big lunch, il pranzo, put on by the prior. The earliest surviving reference to this procession appears in a letter from the late 780s, also preserved in the same manuscript that we're discussing. The letter is addressed by the then abbot of Monte Cassino, Theodemar, to queries into the liturgical life of the monks by a certain Frankish nobleman. And here we see the same broad pattern of a double procession, joining at the old city and ending with a big lunch in the lower township. But there's something different added here. The letter records that monks from all the little celle also gather in this procession. These celle were very important for the economic and agricultural management of the region and the abbey's property. And so we have a hint here that the liturgical procession served a practical administrative goal, to bring everyone to market, as it were, to pay their tithes. Now, the version of the ritual described in the early 10th century manuscript that is at the center of this discussion is far more elaborate than the earlier versions described in the letters. Not only does it specify objects to be carried and provide further detail about recently built churches and their towers, bells, and atriums, but it also specifies some of the texts that are to be sung and read, including chant in both Latin and in Greek. The text is utterly ironic. The ritual so meticulously recorded could not actually be performed. At the time of the manuscript's production, remember, the monks had not lived at Monte Cassino for 4 decades. 4 decades after the destruction of both the upper and lower monastery during Arab raids in 883. The monks would not return to the upper monastery for nearly 30 years. Even when they did return, there is absolutely no evidence that they ever made this procession again. While the Easter Tuesday procession is recalled as a 9th century occurrence in an 11th century history of the Abbey, the procession vanishes from all 11th century ritual books. it's never copied again. One might argue that what is preserved here is less a case of irony, a set of liturgical instructions that any contemporary reader would know not meant to be performed, than a vestige, a memory, perhaps preserved in hope. That might be the way Walter Paul would have interpreted it in his constructivist account of the dossier of documents in the manuscript, had he referred to the liturgical material. Moreover, we could say that the customs that precede and follow this procession in the manuscript are less site-specific and could, with some adjustment, still be performed while the monks were in exile at Capua. So perhaps the scribe simply included this significant set of ritual instructions as part of a textual chunk that he was busy copying. Too obvious and too important a chunk simply to be left out as he was doing his scribal work. But puzzlingly, the text of the procession was not just copied as is, in its presumably mid-9th century pre-destruction form. Instead, and here we come to the nub of the matter, instead, a series of curious additions appear, and it is to these that I wish to turn now. Once the monks have arrived at the lower church, there is, the Ordo notes, a little pause, doubtless to allow the monks to catch their breath a little bit, and the altar party to change into their appropriate vestments. The priests and deacons who will be involved in the Mass vest and proceed in due order to the atrium of the church, where they await the venerable man and priest, no doubt, Betharius. And when he has arrived, surrounded as a heavenly funerary train, at once all the bells ring out and a procession is made with banners, standards, candles, crosses, torches, gospel books, and reliquaries. And the Lord Abbot bears before his chest the gospel book, which Betharius had wondrously made for the Lord and Blessed Benedict. But the Betharius, or Bertha, here so oddly mentioned twice in the rubric. Rubrics are normally anonymous because they have to be reused. The Betharius here so oddly mentioned twice would not be doing any arriving. His book would certainly not be carried by any abbot in the 10th century. As the scribe of this manuscript knew, and as his readers knew, this was simply impossible. Betharius had been murdered inside the church of St. Martin at the summit of Monte Cassino during the Arab raids 30 years earlier. And the treasure book that he had himself had made had disappeared, presumably in the same act of plunder. The curious insertion of the instruction that the liturgical party should surround Abbot Betharius, without doubt, on his way into the basilica as a celestis exequia, takes on a horribly ironic poignancy. The phrase celestes exequiae elsewhere appears in Gregory the Great's account of the hearing of a heavenly funeral procession accompanying the migration of the soul of a pious Roman nun to heaven. The monks of Monte Cassino knew their Gregory the Great very well. Their editorial edition of both historicizing information and visionary allusion effectively undoes or breaks the instructional force of the rubric. Both copyist and reader know that the instructions cannot possibly be followed or intended to be followed as they are written. Indeed, it seems to me that the instructional insertions not only cannot be carried out, but that they can be understood as a negative instruction, meaning the opposite of what they prescribe. The monks of Monte Cassino shall not await Lothaриus. He's not surrounded with ministers in a heavenly funeral cortege as he enters the basilica. He does not carry the treasure gospel book that he donated. The obvious impossibility and contradictory nature of the rubric is underlined and reinforced by the blithe insertion of nec dubium. In fact, there's nothing that could be more doubtful. What is the purpose of this curious insertion? One way of understanding it is as a kind of historiographical gesture, a way of remembering an important abbot who had been killed by raiders, whose donations had been stolen, and whose community had been exiled, by using the language of untrammeled ritual continuity, in order not only to bespeak the opposite, but also to express the writer's attitude to that loss. 40 years after the traumatic events, the 10th century copyist of the Chronicle, the historical section of the manuscript, apparently could not quite bring himself to add any account of the Arab raids. And even at the end of the 10th century, the Cassinese historian Eckham Curtis devoted just a single line to describe this cataclysmic event for his own monastery. Writing of a different context, Elizabeth van Houts has noted that the, quote, shockwaves of horror, pain, regret, and grief in the aftermath of the Norman conquest of England in 1066 were met with near absolute historiographical silence. The memory of these terrible events were preserved rather through saints' lives and fragmentary narrative accounts that were transmitted primarily orally and written down only 4 generations later. The fragmentary records of the conquest and the second generation amount to brief additions to chronicles. Perhaps this is what we're seeing in the rubric. An ironic, a self-contradictory instruction that in some way attempts to process what had happened. It takes 40 years to make even such an oblique reference, perhaps because, as Vladimir Zhonkalevich suggested, art, comedy, and irony become possible only when life-threatening emergency is relieved. But why the choice of a self-contradictory instruction to process this memory? Deirdre Wilson and Dan Sperber have suggested that irony can be understood as an echoic utterance. That is, an utterance in which the speaker's primary intention is not to provide information about the content of an attributed thought, but to convey her own attitude or reaction to that thought. In irony, the attitude to the thought is dissociative. In other words, the speaker rejects a tacitly attributed thought as ludicrously false or blatantly inadequate in other ways. The reason that irony is so frequently used to blame or complain about a person or a terrible state of affairs, lovely weather we're having, isn't it? Is because the authors argue of a normative bias. The weather should be nice, the abbots shouldn't get killed, books shouldn't be stolen, churches shouldn't be burnt down. The ironic utterance here echoes a norm-based expectation that should have been met. Perhaps it is its potential for contradictory simultaneity that makes rubrical and irony, in this case, a particularly adept tool for the expression of enduring shock. Zhonkalevich describes irony as a kind of diplomatic art that manages to combine multiple points of view at one time. Consciousness frees itself, he writes, from its present by also speculating about its absences. The absence of things that are no more, and the absence of things that are not yet. It comprises the one and the other. The justice, by which Jean Gelevich means the situation in which everything is granted its place, the justice of succession, and the justice of coexistence. By introducing a murdered abbot and a stolen book into rubrical instructions for a procession that would not and could not be performed again, the anonymous scribe deftly gave a place to absence in his community. It is a soft touch. Jean Gelevich calls irony an art d'effleurer, the art of lightly brushing up against something, outstripping despair, touching pathos with, quote, an infinitely light touch, helping the reader to, quote, attend to the real, while immunizing him against the strictures and distortions of a kind of intransigent pathos or grief. Thank you.
Asia, so the technical trip to 17th century North India, and the main protagonists of this siege are the sands. You can see some of them. In the center, we have the main guy of literature, probably, Kabir, the famous weaver poet, possibly the most famous poet this period. And the title is possibly ironic in itself, the Cringe Comedy of the last 10 hagiographies, and I will deal with one work primarily. The author is a Ramadan, and he is dated around the 16th and 17th century. And let me just give you an outline of what I'm talking about. First, why this choice? Second, what kind of humor do we have in this work? And is there a humor at all in this work? Does it belong? Does humor belong in a hagiography? The more of this question from Frank Zappa famously asked if humor belongs in music. And what's so funny about the various types of humor I detect in this work? And with the main one being something called the cringe comedy. What is it? How does it work? Of course, satire, you all know. You know better than me what satire is, but I quote a few verses to it also. And I will tell you about some episodes of the Parachai of the hagiographical works that I've chosen. You have to bear with me, I will just explain it to you what this is all about. And then I would like to follow me in reviewing the problem of intentionality or non-intentionality of humor in this work. Because I tend to ask a very general question, is there humor at all? Or maybe I am reading the humor into this work, I'm not so sure. This is a very open scenario. So, why the choice? The hagiographies of Anandadas is a series of works devoted to the lives of notable North Indian sons. This is a work written in so-called early Hindi, speaking Rajabhat. As such, this work abounds in numerous episodes that carry, so the title, a humorous appeal, to me at least. The vis comica of those episodes is usually connected in some way with the unconventional or eccentric behavior of the son protagonists and their opponents belonging to the Hindu and Muslim religious establishment, mostly Brahmins. Okay, can a hagiography be fun? If it can, what kind of humor does it present? And what purpose does this humor serve? Is it intentional, non-intentional, unintentional? And there are interesting implications to both answers. finding an answer. And to whom, yeah, is this text found? Because I can't really find a good answer to the very large question, being a non-specialist in literary theory at all. Am I reading the humor into this work, or is it actually there? Was it actually there to those who listened to this work back in the day? What kind of humor is present in this work? I think satire is satire mainly on the Brahmins. There are some instances of absurd, surreal humor, situational humor, cringe comedy, well, possibly, and possibly irony. I'm not so sure of. I detect a slight ironic touch that another was left in his work. This require further elaboration. What's so funny about those genres of comedy? Satire, of course, exaggeration. Surreal comedy, the illogicality of the situations we are given. Situational humor, I'm not so sure. There are many instances. It's mixed. Cringe comedy is funny because it's embarrassing. It's a very interesting type of laughter that is used. Irony, of course, for me, is deciphering the true meaning lying behind all text. The secondary meanings. Basically, it's a recap of what you were telling us for last 2 days. So, what about this cringe comedy? According to Cambridge Dictionary, it's the type of humor that makes you laugh at things that are very embarrassing. In other words, something that makes you laugh and wince at the same time. It's based on empathy. So you have to be sacrificed, experience cringe. One feels the sense that he carries embarrassment and simultaneously and awkwardness in a cringy situation. And to my mind, the choreographies of Ananda Das are full of cringy. Therefore, cringe is not Schadenfreude. In Schadenfreude, we are happy that somebody has the Schaden. Yeah? And here we can we endure it. We find pleasure in this. That somebody slips on a banana. But here now, it's a different experiences. Cringe is not a joyful experience. It might even be painful, hence the empathy. Yet somehow it coexists with laughter. So it's a LOL WTF experience. Experience those two conflicting emotions at the same time. And so a difficult experience to be sure. Not interesting. So, of course, satire, but just a recap. I like this definition I found that in Europe, satire has two roots, while irony originates in ancient Greeks, and satire has something Roman about it. I like it. It's powerful and bold attack, the abundance of crudeness is present in satire, the strong disapproval and rejection of anything that falls outside norms, delineated by what is established as common sense. So satire is a judgment. And as such, it is predicated on a strict differentiation between the moral categories of right and wrong. We always know what the satirist is, where is he or she standing. Governed by the principle of Horace, we don't need so after saying what is true, and I think it's well, puzzle universal, so we can really adapt. We are, of course, very aware of those facts. So let me just give you a little story about the episodes in the Parachai series that possibly carry a creepy flavor of some sorts. Let us begin with satire. It is directed towards the mores of the Brahmanic culture in general. Ritualism, the ritualist festivals and worship of idols are being targeted because that represents the heterodox. For example, the first son, and possibly the oldest of the parachai, is the Namdev parachai. We have an episode in which Namdev is outweighing a massive amount of precious metals donated by Brahmins and merchants with one tulsi plant leaf with the name Ram written on it. It is more heavy than all the gold and silver and all the precious things donated by Brahmins, and you get the general idea. Secondly, Raivas, the son of the Chamar caste, initiates a certain Quinjali. The Brahmins are depicted as reacting with all kinds of over-the-top hysterical and self-destructive behavior. They sit in burning sun, bite their tongues, swallow poison, or even rend their clothing or running off the court. With different reactions. Of course, you get the general gist of it. It's a satire on Brahmins' uprightiousness. Different son, Pipa, a former king who rejects his kinghood and becomes a Bhakta, is depicted as a worshipper of deity who, after 12 years of worship, 12 years of being worshipped by Pipa, announces herself as a false deity and recommends Pipa as a true spiritual guide. Don't worship me, go to Ramananda, he will initiate you, you will become a true son, saint. Okay. In this case, I'm just getting ahead of myself here, but in this case, well, of course, we have satire, but what is actually funny to me is not the anti-Brahmanic satire, but the cringy effect produced by the overtly didactical and naive character of the scene. And now the big question arises. Is it funny because I'm reading this cringiness into this didactic effect? Because I'm a reader, 21st century European male, heterosexual white male? I'm not sure. Possible. Okay. Next, satire as well. Abraham wants to commit suicide because Pipa, his patron, is leaving the kingdom for good. So he is lost. He's not with the perspective of losing his patron. So he reacts with a suicidal sentiment. Namdev, back to Namdev, is said to strictly observe the Ekadashi fast. However, he is taught by a wise Brahmin. Is an example of who has authority on the futility of fasting. Of course, unable to convince him, the Brahmin decides to commit suicide by burning, but the son decides to join him. And a divine intervention occurs. Hari, Brahma, appears in the burning fire and drags Namdev with him. It's a situational humor here. And now, read scenes. This kind of comedic potential is present in the three enigmatic scenes from Kabir Parachai when the main protagonist is seen as fleeing the scene and hiding himself. Every time, this is related somehow to gift giving. Three scenes that are depicted by David Lawrence, who translated this work as somewhat mysterious. First, Hari arrives at Kabir, at Kabir's house as an emancipated devotee, begging for some cloth to wear. Kabir immediately offers him all that he has, being a good bhakta he is. He does not return home, but remains hidden for 3 days, while the people of his family go hungry. Eventually, it is Hari who brings food to Kabir's mother and children, but he remains in hiding, being a bold individual that he is. Why? This gives us cringy feeling. Why not? Second, Kabir organizes a Mahotcha, festivity, during which he gives everything away. Later, he is confronted by angry Brahmins and sannyasis who were not fed at this party and try to force a dana of food on him. Having nothing to offer because he is spent, he leaves the house and hides away. Harry, assuming the weaver's form, takes the role of the host again, procures the goods, and feeds the guest. So again, the divine intervention occurs. For instance, the Brahmins sent Kabir an invitation to a fake festivity supposedly organized by him. This is a ruse they come up with. People flock to the poet's cabin. Seeing them, he flees and hides. Again, because he has nothing to offer. Harry magically, again, appears, multiplies himself as many Kabirs, distributes the goods, and gives cloth to the gatherers' back cast. Again, Kabir, as the protagonist, seeks the company of a prostitute. He pretends to be a drunkard to discourage people from following him. Because he couldn't devote his time to what he really wanted to do, that is to meditate on the name of Ram. Pipa organizes a meeting of the Bhaktas for the money earned by the selling of his wife's clothes. This is allowed, as you can see. Again, my favorite, possibly. Robbers come to Pipa's house to steal his buffaloes, but he offers them the cows as well. So you have not taken the cows. Please do. Have yourself to the cow. Again, Pipa chases after different band of robbers to give them money they forgot to take from his house. Imagine the scene. Imagine the scene. He chases after them and look, they've left those. Please take. In the Pipa Parachai, there are 4 episodes that show Pipa procuring his wife Sita to various men. In 2 instances, for the purpose of feeding the Bhaktas. However, she always remains untouched. So she prostitutes herself, but no man can touch her. All those episodes serve the purpose of edification, proselytization. Somebody always ends up being a new member of the Bhakta community. In a different part of the Pipa Parachai, Anantadas remarks that if a young oil woman would be converted to Bhakti, she would be best suited for bringing the work of God to perfection. I will return to this particular one. Okay, situational humor. Harry jumping from the pyre, we've seen that. Ramananda initiating Kabir by treading on him. Famous story in which Kabir lays down on the ghats in Varanasi, and Ramananda steps on him in the dark, thereby initiating him. Ramananda ordering Pipa to jump into a well to prove that he is waiting for initiation. Pipa jumping into the sea to meet Krishna and Rukmini in Dwaraka, which is submerged. Not bothered by the crocodile. Pipa making a gift of an oxen that does not belong to him. Why not? Pipa chasing the robbers, you see that. So quite a lot. Funny episodes. So intentionality and the purpose of this kind of humor. 2 possibilities. If we assume that humor in the Parachais is unintentional, which is a possibility, then the humorous effect is simply a byproduct of the overt religious zeal and the awkwardness displayed by the sounds. They are awkward as social beings. Did Anantadas make them as such, or were they as such in history? Open to discussion. Also, the blatantly didactic nature of some of the episodes produces an unintentionally funny effect. But maybe it is only us, the modern readers, who laugh. And back to the beautiful oil selling girl. He remarks, and why is this line funny? Was it funny to the listeners of Anantadas' work back in the day? She would bring the work of Ram to perfection if she became a Bhakta, because she's a handsome lady. Why does it make me laugh? Possibly because it's sexist in a cringy way. Today, it sounds like this. Did it sound like that back in the day? But if we assume that the humor in Anatoldas' work is intentional, then both the adversaries of the Sans and the Sans themselves should be seen as comic figures. So the Brahmins, the Mullahs, the Qazis are clearly objects of satire. They are members of the religious establishment. They are to be mocked. And what is the function of satire in this case? That's quite simple. If satire means taking a clear moral stance and calling for a redistribution of power, then by showing the Brahmins in an unfavorable light, Anantadas stresses the anti-establishment stance of this tradition, the tradition of the Sans. But are the Sans themselves really meant to appear as a museum? So I would say that it is improbable that Anantadas would make fun of the Sans themselves in a way analogous to the Brahmins and all those representatives of the establishment. So then why do they appear sometimes as awkward individuals whose actions makes the reader or the listener cringe? Again, this reader now, or also the listeners of the 17th century. I'm still not unsure about this. So possible solutions to this problem, again, twofold. And the cringe effect is in reality like this, then but what produces this effect is the overt religious zeal and the lack of self-criticism displayed by the Sans. But is Anantadas to blame? Maybe this was a strong topic of behavior among the Sans community. But what if the cringe effect is intentional? If so, I would see this kind of humor as a part of a bigger skill and means strategy, which utilizes comedy to show the Sans as God's madmen. The Sans are the order of the Brahmanic society, and the orthodox behavior is incomprehensible for most of its representatives. And so the humor only works for the unenlightened. That is, only for the worldly people, the Sans actions may seem funny or comical in a cringy way. In reality, being laughable means being chosen by God, which in any case must be serious business indeed. So they are being laughed at, they are meant to be laughed at, but those who laugh are in error. If this is the case, then for Anantadas, humor is, of course, not the goal in itself. It's not a humorous writer for the sake of being a humorous writer. It is there to make us consider the Sans social religious position and their religious mission. It seems that Anantadas uses humor as a tool for expressing social religious dissent. It is a weapon against the Brahmanic ideologies and wars. He uses comedic elements to push his pedagogical agenda, in which humor supports the expansion of the Bhakta community. As I told you before, in those cringy episodes, somebody ends up being a good Bhakta. Somebody ends up being converted to Bhaktism. And additionally, it acts as a moral support by reminding us that the joke is in reality of those who laugh at the Sans, as they cannot comprehend the mysterious ways in which God works. And of course, his servants or slaves being the Son himself. So humor serves a social role. It supports the organizing of a Bhakta community around charismatic but bizarre figures, which are remindful of the Yunadevi of the Orthodox Christianity, the Bauls of Bengal, the Buddhist and Shaiva Siddhas, and many more instances in the world religions of those kind of figures. But let me just ask one last question. But can it be possible that Anantadas is in fact dead serious all the way, and his work should be read as a satire on humor? If so, the joke's on us.
Yes.
Thank you.
And now we can start.
Okay, good afternoon. We start with the final session. So these days we have tried to agree on the different meaning of irony, sarcasm, humor, satire. We are undoubtedly aware that these concepts have different meaning depending on the geographical and cultural context. But among them, regardless of question of theory or rhetoric or cataloging, they have a common thread to elicit a smile or laughter in the user. What is the purpose of wanting to elicit this laughter, and what is the target audience to which it is addressed? To understand the uniquely human phenomenon that takes on the faces of laughter and smiles, rivers of ink have flowed from antiquity to the present. However, even today, the difficulty of understanding the true nature, causes, and relationship of laughter and smiling is difficult to grasp. To respond to this request, there are various theories on laughter developed over the centuries. We have mentioned in previous sessions the superiority theory, the incongruity theory, and so on. In this session, we ask specifically, what is a humor? According to Pirandello, it is the feeling of the opposite generated by reflection, which is explained to us by the author himself through an image. I see an old lady with her hair dyed and then strangely rouged and dressed in youthful clothes. I start laughing. I warn that old lady is the opposite of what a respectable old lady should do to be. So at first glance and superficially, I can stop at this comic impression. The comedian is precisely a warning of the contrary. But if now the reflection intervenes me and suggests me that old lady maybe doesn't enjoy covering up as well as a parrot, but that she perhaps suffers from it, and she made it only to keep her husband's love that is much younger than her. Here I can no longer laugh at her as before, precisely because a reflection working in me made me go beyond that first warning or rather deeper. From that early warning to the contrary made me switch to this one feeling of the opposite. What emerges from this brief quotation is this sense of incongruity, deformation, sense of inadequacy with respect to existing norm. Existing norm of taste or good taste, of the rule of custom. Exactly, we saw yesterday morning entire quote from Natasha, for example. The breaking of the rule and feeling of the opposite lead us to reflection that induces the opening of a spiritual reality, a kind of rift that leads us to question what surrounds us or thinking it with form or simply with a different reading. Once more quoting Pirandello, fantasy doesn't create in the strict sense of the word, that is, it does not produce generally new forms. If in fact we examine even the strangest grotesque sample winged monster, we will always find it more or less alterated by their combination images responding to real sensations. But a form in a certain sense corresponding to the grotesque in the figurative art we find in the art of speech. And it is precisely in the macaronic style language that is constituted with a lexical background, partly vernacular and partly Latin. Arbitrary creation, monstrous contamination of different elements of the cognitive material, as we sense that it erodes precisely as a rebellion and as mockery. The power of the word decline in the ironic form and of the consequential use of the literary tool is a weapon used over the century from west and to east in the political world to undermine, erode, or conversely create alliance. This is two examples of grotesque art in Europe and in India, for example. However, on each of these explanations seems inadequate to cover the polyvalence of Luther and its breadth and depth. Luther's smiling is a multifaceted, elusive, and profound phenomenon. The expression and logics that determine it constitute a complex and dynamic web with the continuous interplays of similarities and oppositions. In this regard, it also worth recalling the very The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. Anyone who has read the novel will remember that through the entire plot over the spectre of Luther. The motive of the murders that took place in the monastery is very specific, the phantom second book of Aristotle's Poetics. It is a phantom chapter, the most enigmatic in the history, a treatise of Luther and the comic. In the novel, the Venerable Jorge de Burgos accidentally discovers this book in the convent library and immediately hides it. The motive of his murder is precisely to keep it secret and prevent anyone from reading it. He does this because he is aware that Luther is an antidote to fear. It is precisely Luther in its many facets that is portrayed as one of the great human mysteries. Eco thinks that Luther is related to the fact that human beings are the only animals who know that they are destined to die. And thus he conveys of it a reaction to such awareness that helps us face the prejudices of life. He argued that Luther has the power to cast a shadow of suspicion of all dogmatic truths and preconvincing the idea, which is why it is opposed not only by theologians, but also by philosophers and politics. As early as 1967, as a kind of a precursor of The Name of the Rose, he wrote an article for the Italian Weekly Express titled The Enemy of Philosophers, in which he identified Luther as the deceptive enemy of thinkers of all ages, precisely because of its skeptical potential and multiplicity of meaning. The power of word and language creating itself and taking on a form of style rebellious to rhetoric is what Piotr Borek will illustrate to us in negotiation, political alliance through mockery and sarcasm. So now it's your turn.
Thank you for the introduction, Christine, and I would also like to thank you very much, Elena, for the organization, for the talk today here, and for wonderful organization of this conference. Perfect, really. It is. So, my interest in satire, especially in the form and in the origins of satire in the text I used to work on, is driven by, I would say, two things, like two aims, two purposes. One thing is that I believe that analyzing this satire, the form and the origin of satire in a Brajbasha text, in 17th century Brajbasha text, can tell us more about the audience, how wide were the circles of recipients of such texts. And another thing is that I believe it can tell us more about the complexity of Brajbasha poetics. Not Brajbasha, but the poetics of this courtly ornate poetry of this Hindi literary tradition, which is very vaguely, in general, is believed to be kind of here to Sanskrit poetics with many innovations on which there is already quite quite a lot of studies. So first of all, the poem I'm talking about is Shivraj Bhushan. It's a poem composed in 1673 at the court of Shivaji, commissioned by Shivaji, but by a poet who comes from Trivikrampur, which is near Kanpur. It's a Brahmin poet. And in general, this text is this poetical treatise is being perceived, especially today, but not only today, as a very serious poem. We have an image of a very serious poem. For example, if you look into the introductions to the first printed editions, which from the 19th century, of this poem, these editors justify the publishing and they go by praising how exemplary is Shivaji Maharashtra identity, and that is why this poem is so important, should be should be offered to the readers. Historians of Hindi literature most often underline the importance of this poem because of the virrasa, or like Sanskrit is mostly, I should say, virrasa, that is dominating. And which forms kind of a contrast to our general view of this poetry literature of literary tradition of our modernity, which is usually associated with Sringara rasa, with exceptions. Yeah, but this feature is underlined, continuously underlined by the history of mostly 20th century history. If you look at in general, like at this poem, and how it is rendered also in other medias today, for example, maybe not exactly rendered, but we have for example, we have a TV series Star Prabha, which is on Shivaji, which is partially inspired by this poem. If we look at some like monuments of Shivaji, which use with parts like stanzas from this poem inscribed, we see it as like a serious recreation of the image of Shivaji as a legitimate, generous, capable ruler, worthy opponent to Aurangzeb. And the poem is replicating genealogy fabricated by renowned Duris Gagabhatta. It displays various deeds of the hero whose forefathers served to the sultanates. If we, for example, imagine how the first performance of this poem could look like in the Sabha in Raina in Shivaji's court, so it starts from also serious subjects, rulers, genealogy, description of the new royal capital, lofty recreations of Shivaji's anger, brave recreation towards Aurangzeb, reaction towards Aurangzeb, complex comparison to Arjuna from Mahabharata, who compared the Kaurava just Shivaji did with Shaista Khan, and so on and so on. As you could see from the title, I'm looking in this poem for. I'm trying to look at the satire present in this poem, something that comes from not necessarily from Sanskrit literary culture, but from Persian literary culture, also from Urdu. But first we should think whether there was something like political satire, which is dominant in Shivraj Bhushan, whether it was present in the Sanskrit literature. So Kshamendra was already discussed. We have a little bit more complex picture of the Dashopadesha, that he's given as an example of someone who introduces the mode of social satire to wrongdoers, misers, prostitutes, assorted cheats. And we can, at least from an introduction to the part of this translation of this letter by Vasudeva, we can conclude the satire here aims primarily at correcting the satirists, not to destroy them. Okay. The contents and context of satirical writing encompass three major categories, such as satire of manners, social satire, and religious satire. So this is what actually this is kind of a summarizing statement by Siegel in his synthetic work on satire in Indian literature. And it happens within areas such as love and pleasure, duty and righteousness, religious practice, and education, respectively. And then Siegel also concludes the satire is a term which, in the Indian context, must refer to an aesthetic attitude rather than a fixed literary form, a diffused genre that pervades other specific defined genres. It is a tone, he says. In vernacular literature, of the vernacular literature, some vernacular literatures of North India, and for this we have quite a complex study. A few studies gathered by Monika Horstman and Heidi Poels, studies on satire in first modernity. In regional literatures of North India. So we get a picture of texts that contain religious and social satire, mostly not political one. Satire is more appropriately understood as a form of discourse which may slip into various genres and which invades genres with the intent to deconstruct this. And what is satire being satirized is religious hypocrisy, religious arrogance, orthodoxy, or competitive aims of religious community. For example, Bhattacharya, who provides one of the studies to the Osman Poles, and this is a study on Bengali literature, says that the practice of satirical discourse present in European literature that wants to hurt, if not to destroy its object more than to correct it and be considered absent. Irony and mockery are rather used to redress what is felt to be wrong or to attempt at reforming social ill. So in a way we may say that vernacular literature on North India before the 17th century produced a distinct form of political satire, neither irony nor allegory nor mockery that permit through such texts seem pervasive enough to dominate the effort and take an attempt to transform the existing genre into a satirical one. I hope some of you will be able to disagree and provide you that. It's a bit different, it's totally different when we look at the literature. For example, Jan Rybka states that satirists, if the authors of the slanderous writings can be so designated, appear in enormous number from the earliest times up to the most recent. Hajv is an invective lampoon with a particular person. Which is quite important for my further presentation, with a particular person as target, is very closely associated with the aristocratic system. There is also another category of, this is puzzle, which denotes comical, and is opposite of Ged, of the category of Ged in Persian literature series. Often refers to sexual objects, and it is a contradiction to poetical politeness, and is often considered an inferior form of mockery. And the early example of Hajj, often imitated later, is also somehow bound to South Asia, you may say. So this in Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, which is harsh satire on patrons' behavior, who did not respond to the reward he had promised, because he believed that he had promised to Firdausi one gold coin for each verse, but he has given him finally silver sikka. So this is, and there are many examples of this type of hazel in Persian literature. Now, if we come closer to the geographical and temporal area of this Rajbasha literary culture, to our ancestors' court, we have very interesting cases described concerning Persian literature, in the Persian literature and also in Urdu literature. And I draw those cases from a very interesting study by Abhishek Kechker, published just 3 years ago. And actually, this is the book that inspired me to look again at Shivraj Bhushan and see what is there, you know, like what it has in terms of satire. So, for example, Kechker provides an example of Nimad Kamiali, who humiliated Aurangzeb's chamberlain for high and low, by calling him and his married spouse a captain of 2 puissants. He remained unpunished. He wrote a complaint to Aurangzeb, and then Aurangzeb rejected this complaint, which was probably caused by the fact that earlier Nimad Ali Khan wrote another text that expertly undermined Aurangzeb's assertion of sovereignty in the very terms of its enunciation. So we may say that probably Aurangzeb was a little bit afraid, you know, like of doing something against the poem. So Nimad Khan Ali remained unpunished. Members of Persian literary culture are apparently aware that the biggest danger of satirical poetry is the remarkable speed with which the poet's mockeries were transmitted, not the harshness, but the speed. You know, like, so it's also relevant for what I'll be talking about Shivraj Bhushan, because we can see here that this mockery is can be perceived as kind of motor, you know, speeding up the dissemination of the text. Again, in Aurangzeb's court, so we have a interesting case of Mir Jafar Zatali composing predominantly in Urdu, and he has been studied by Faruqi, but Abhishek Kechker also refers to him. Zatali devoted his entire talent to biting, obscenity, and invective-filled satire, and also to pornography. The discourse of political satire in the inversions is present in the inversions of news reports. So we can read them some criticism of administration, noblemen, and also of the emperor himself, by uttering the precise inversion of the discourse of sovereignty as it manifests in the space of the city. Commenting the misgovernance of Khani Jahan, or drawing a caricatural picture of Lahore, where besides jackals and foxes and moongazes, scorpions, venomous serpents, there remains not even a trace of man. Also an interesting example of, let's say, kind of mockery, and that we may find some parallel to in Shivraj Bhushan. Again, another relevant point is a technique applied by Zatali who uses Arabic register to mock on Aurangzeb's faith and piety, and he's lost to this language, or he's lost to this language usually by putting this Arabic register into his mouth. So now, if we turn to Shivraj Bhushan, it's necessary to say something about language of this poetical treatise of almost 400 stanzas. So we see their frequent use of Persian and Arabic register. So this is a feature which is not unique in this currently branch partial literary culture. It happened quite often, maybe not very often, but it happened. You know, there are also studies mostly by Alison Bush devoted to this feature of courtly poetry in Braj Bhasha. So in a way it's not unique, but now let's imagine that we have to imagine that the poem, Shivraj Bhushan, has been commissioned by future king, we will say a chieftain, Shivaji, who later on introduced in his kingdom the whole let's say project that reminds us of some kind of cultural linguistic purism. I mean, namely he attempted to introduce Sanskrit as the language of the administration, language of the state, and it happened in. We have to remember that it happened in the Deccan, actually in the areas in the kingdom carved out of built on the lands carved out of the Deccani sultanates, where Persian and Deccani had long remained languages of aesthetic cultivation. So now, the question is why Bhushan loaded his poem with poetical treatise with Persian and Arabic registers since it had been commissioned by such a figure. So we may ask a question, could not this apparent lack of poets' efforts toward any kind of linguistic purity be a pragmatic procedure aimed to raise the interest among wider Cyprus audience, a significant part that was primarily bound to the neighboring literary culture of Persia? Neighboring not only, I don't mean only the Mughal court, but also the Deccani courts. And if the linguistic trait of the poem was subject to exemption from the patron's agenda of cultural politics, this must have been for the purpose of dissemination. Okay, so now how this satire, instances of satire, there is in mockery, look like in the text. So first of all, we very often see instances of personal attack, and of course a figure that is very often attacked is Aurangzeb. So Bhushan twists his name into a vernacular Avaranga. So Aurangzeb adorning the throne now means devoid of color or sickly pale. Okay, so this is this is quite pervasive in the whole text. This is one thing, very much pervasive in the sense that it becomes the name, the actual name of the Mughal emperor. It's being repeated many times, and it contrasts with logic Shiva, which is being used for Shiva or Siva, depending on the edition of the text on the manuscript, which is being used to refer to the main protagonist, to Shivaji, and can bring connotation with godly figure, of course. Or Saraja, for example, of Davon, which depends on the register, maybe either chieftain, either lion. Or, for example, Aurangzeb is being referred to as Jakarta, which means car or stain, and it is also a vernacular twist of being the name of Aurangzeb's lineage, Jan Chagatai. Then we have many examples of caricatural, if not grotesque, sometimes pictures. For example, Shivaji got enraged, and this is the description of a situation which took place in 1666 when Shivaji went to Mughal Darbar, the great Darbar, and was not treated as he lived, according to his rank. So he got enraged and made imperial courtiers faint. And then we have instances of it envisioning the ideological line, formulating critics of wrong alliances, to an example of Rupaka. The ocean of Kali Yuga is full of turtles, fishes, alligators, and it is these are identified with Malechka or Malechka barbarians, sinful, which further on are identified uniquely only with this Muslim figures, the Kani nobles or Mughals. And it is continuously fed by rivers, which stand for apathetic kings, but Hindu kings. Colorable parody of Purusha Sukta. This is how I see it. See one of the stanzas that constructs instead of primeval man the body of Kali Yuga, with Aurangzeb as the head, Abbas Shah of Persia as his heart, sultans of Bijapur and Golconda as arms, other Muslims, nobles, barbarians as its legs. Then another technique is subverting Kavya conventions. Another technique of building this kind of caricatural pictures is subverting Kavya conventions. For example, likening Aurangzeb's face instead of woman's face to the moon, or comparing Muslims to red lotuses which blossom only in the night. So this instance of likening Aurangzeb's face to the moon, I think it might be already the first, this is where I spot the first instance of attacking his manliness, which is being developed further on the poem. Yeah, so let's have a look at this stanza 72, part of stanza 72. Via paharana pasa na jahu yom pahadura kom kahen sokhe. So darling, do not go close to the mountains. A woman's face with a brave one, or Bahadur Khan, because brave is Bahadur, and soaks in tears. Oh Nawab, who will save you from the anger of the hostile king? So this is kind of my interpretation, yeah, that maybe we should read this stanza as kind of maybe we should look at it as an instance of women instructing men on their duties, which should not happen actually. But we can also look at it as an instance of subversion, another instance of subversion of politics, because this stanza apparently makes us think of this Viraha convention, of men going away from home. Other interesting instance of attacking manliness is in stanza 90. We have after fight scenery after Battle of Salher in 1672, where nobles, khans, and amirs defeated by the Marathas prefer humiliation to death. So they pretend to be Kazis or Brahmacharis just to be run away from the battlefield in disguise. Then mocking at cowardice happens through this Shlesha, also with the use of Shlesha, also Kasha Shlesha. And these are some examples. The Marathas enemies get ready to flee just on hearing about the arrival of Shivaji. But soon they will be able to sigh with relief, for someone instructs them that the news is not about coming of the Maratha chief, but of the god Shiva. So it's fine, yeah, we are safe. Siva Ayo, and we think it's Shivaji is coming. Yeah. It's not just Shiva. Or a quasi-anecdote of Aurangzeb recounting his dream. So he says that the lion's mighty claws and strength provided by the goddess Durga attacked me in the forest. He tells his dream. His ministers almost panicked. For the understood different thing, this is Bhaja Shivashaya, we have a strong thanks to the forts he masters, defeated Shivaji, strong thanks to the force he masters, defeated the emperor with powerful strikes of knuckle buster on the battlefield. Or direct satire on the Mughal emperor, another one, during a hunting expedition, someone informed Aurangzeb about a lion approaching the army. Aurangzeb fainted because he misunderstood that the top was Shivaji. Yeah, the same word, Sarja in Persian register is a lion, in vernacular it's head of chieftain, they say. Okay, but to be frank, we have also instances of reformative satire, which reminds more of this Sanskrit literary tradition of instances of satirical writing in Sanskrit or early modern vernacular literary traditions. But this kind of satire is pointed at non-Muslims. So, for example, several Rajputs who joined the Mughal service in the poem become mere imperial servants busy with rather low occupations. Maharana Udaipur abandons his sword. So here it's quite direct. It is satire, but usually it's not. Like when it's pointed at non-Muslims. He abandons his sword to praise the emperor, while the others take the whisk to fan or chase flies away from Aurangzeb. Then, for example, we have a Shilashara which contains two distinct simultaneous narrations. One is on the attachment to the services of a courtesan. The other reading of the same stanza is on being tempted by the benefits of serving in the imperial army. Yeah, the conclusion, you will lose everything. Yeah, if you get attached to a courtesan, you lose everything. Or you may read, if you get, if you serve to the Mughal army, the same will happen with you. You will lose everything. But here, I think we have a stanza which I think in ways tells what might be the aim of such satirical verses. Gita Hubli Orangame Sara Chhatravadi Chandi, Tajita Huko Abaraki Sarajame Mandi. So victory left all kings and stick to Aurangzeb. Now it abandoned him and adorns Shivaji. Yeah, so beware. I mean, it's kind of a warning. Yeah, don't stick to the imperial army. Better become the ally of Shivaji. If we go back for a while to try to remember, what I said about this Zatali, basing obviously on Edgar's Farouqi's study, and his description of the city of Lahore, the state of the city of Lahore, which is the consequence of the misgovernance of one of the nobles. So in Shivraj Bhushan we have something similar. Palaces and villages of the country attacked by Shivaji get populated with tigers, predatory cats, wolves, wild boars, bears, herds, elephants in heat, rhinoceros, and lizards. And disorder reaches its climax with lions in the camel yard, cheetahs in the elephant stable, monkeys in the hen houses. And okay, maybe the audience already lost, maybe not yet. If not, then ultimately the poet feeds the audience with a bit of obscenity. The antelopes replace whooping in the heart, and goes with fangs bite, God knows which parts of the body, since they bite in the latrines. Okay, So just to summarize, we have, I can say that we have two categories of satire in Shivraj-Bhushan that serve two disparate ends. One category I would say is the satire that warns. Okay, satire that warns is of pretty clearly reformative nature, yeah, and such satire is pointed towards Rajput, sometimes some other things. So we have here moral concern that is brought to stage only when the satire happen to be potential political allies or allies of his patron, of Shivaji. And the tone is rather indirect, although sometimes he brings to the fore some specific political figures and reminds of values as if the point wanted to reform some social ill. And another category would be satire that destroys and this persistently creates a biased picture of usually also some figures or some groups. And so this is the pervasive discourse that aims to hurt or destroy its object rather than correct it. And this type of satirical verses are rather aggressive, meted out to the core of the Mughal Empire, not a harsh and direct. And yeah, that's, I think I said already, it's not limited to single stanzas or line, it repeats and you can say permits the text and is the performance.
Yeah. I'm going to show a few pictures, not only text. I have my reasons for that. Before somehow accounting for why I'm showing locomotive machines and the process of the next country, let me say why Indulekha, which is a so-called first modern novel in Malayalam. That's because I took this opportunity of this inventive event to say something as an outcome of the project we've been doing with Piotr and Jarek and a couple of others colleagues, which spans itself from dates precisely given, which may sound a little bit funny. The beginning is set in 1674, a year after the Shiv-Bhushan text, namely the date of the coronation of Shivaji, and the end is set in 1890, which is the date of the English translation of this novel, as marking some sort of like a new breaking line of order for something new coming, and the project has ambitions of saying that within this time period something happened. So while this beautiful engine, which is, as I remember well, a specimen of a Baylor Peacock locomotive built for Madras Railway in 1860 in one of the British foundries. And Madras Railway was was in the vanguard of the railway network in its beginnings. And what is the connection? I hope pictures will speak for themselves. This is a period that not only over there in the region which I'm targeting is full of changes, big changes. We have World Weekend, sometimes some of us walking, some not actually. Passage to India, it's difficult to say when it was written. It comes from a volume that appeared several times with different dates, and it's contents actually differ. And passage stream is from the volume of Bits of Grass from 1872. And railroads figure prominently in Walt Whitman's poetry. So is India, but in a very peculiar meaning. Yes, railroads probably American rather than Indian. India, in a very specific sense, especially in the sense of passage to India, something new, something overwhelming, something taking the characters with force. This thing which helped me thinking about this picture, which helped me thinking about what's going on in this novel, is one of my favorite. I associated it with Bruno Latour, but Bruno Latour is not to blame, he's not associated with pictures. But knowledge, for me, also information. It's trains, it's rail networks to spread. Yes. So still about railways, in 1853, a new network was proposed to Lord Dalhousie, and quite soon first chunks of the railway appeared, and as I said, Madras presidency was one of the first here, though the first actually line was opened in Mumbai. 1875 and 1871, I don't know, visible from you, it's not so important except for one line which comes from here, which is Calicut in Malabar through Madras and this way through the dominions of Hyderabad to Mumbai. This is important for the novel because the protagonist of the novel, Madhavan, travels to Mumbai and travels by that way, not by the railway which is natural for us, which is the Konkan Railway. Konkan Railway was built quite recently, and some of us may even remember that we needed to travel from Malabar to Mumbai via Madras. And this has a tremendous impact on literary cultures. And I remember while once doing a project on Akshara Shloka documentation in Kerala, I met time and again with stories, sort of modern legends told by the Akshara Shloka exponents, saying that they were ready to recite the Akshara Shlokas constantly for something like 19 hours when they traveled from Mumbai to Calicut. Why? Train does not go that long. But they meant this way, yes, via Madras. Yes, so it made it imprint on the, maybe not in the literature itself, but about what contextualizes. So this line is important for what happens in the novel. And what I'm going to say to you is the first chunk, first fragment of this line. Compare Liverpool, Manchester was opened in 1830, Paris Saint-Germain in 1837. Of course, disconnected to the wider network of communication, the British Empire, Canal Suez was opened in 1869, and why I'm showing that is that the publishing of this novel was 1889. So in the mind of this author must have been somehow present, and it's not only my invention, I think, because the thought proves it. So we are, and the author of our novel is, and his audiences is within a wider context of the British Empire. I love this triple F alliteration: freedom, fraternity, federation, which is of course a purposeful distortion of the French idea of égalité, fraternité. There is no égalité here, it's a federation, it's a different idea. So this is also the time of print. Malabar is the area where the print was present in Indian subcontinent at the earliest time with the Portuguese, but never made it into something that we would call more or less public. This is in Malabar and in wider Kerala, This comes not earlier than, let's say, middle 19th century. So the print in the sense of the mass printing, whatever, of course, it means different things in many different areas, but something like that was the experience in these areas not earlier than mid-19th century. Something that helped me thinking about these two is the person of this forgotten theoretician of thinking about empires and civilization through media, not through political history. I don't have time now to comment it, but I would be very tempted to. Another quotation from the same work by Hamdinas, 1950, is quite peculiar. All the written works, including this one, have dangerous implications to the vitality of an oral tradition and to the health of a civilization, particularly if they thwart the interest of a people in culture and, following Aristotle, the cathartic effects of culture. This is the last one, don't worry. A continuator of the same idea, John Durham Peters, author of one of the most aesthetically pleasing academic work of the last decade, I think, entitled The Marvelous Clouds, a philosopher of media, who says among others that media are not just devices of information, they are agencies of order, in the sense that not order is something against disorder, that many orders. The media creates, reconfigures a new order, yes? So that's the thing. It does not look particularly attractive, and that's the first edition. I don't know if you can see it from this distance. It's a little bit small. 1889, and the second edition, 1890. Both of them came from Spectator Press, which was a British journal press in Calicut over there. And Calicut at that time operated at least a dozen of journals and 2 printing presses. Immediately the thing was translated into English a year later. By a man who was British, who worked in Madras presidency as holding an official post of a translator to one of the units of the bigger units of the Madras army, the author Chandu Menon, which is quite meaningful for this ceremony, had a peculiar biography. He learned English at an early stage. He belonged to a sort of attempted to say middle class, to Nayars, but judging by his name, Menon was a little bit a shelf rather upper in Nayars than lower. So probably his family could afford that, and he was lucky and bright enough to find a job within the administration of the British Malabar at that time. British Malabar, from more or less the beginning of the 19th century, become part of the Madras presidency, but we not always remember that first, something like more or less 8 or 9 years, if I remember, we belonged to the Mumbai presidency, but after several Malabar commissions, it was introduced, it was included in the Madras presidency, which is also a meaningful fact for this map story. And it connects to the Israeli, have no connection to Mumbai at that time. He was lucky to meet one of these ingenious Scots in the service of the British India Company, named William Logan, with a sense for ethnographic of the environment, so to say, or rather, we should say the British possessions, yes? And the author of the huge volume named Malabar Manual, a very strange title, British at that time somehow came up with the idea it is possible to describe in detail the possessions in order to make sense of what's going on there. And of course, how much it is worth in terms of the possibility and probability of extracting the taxes, yes? So probably, or even not probably, because Chandravanan himself introduces this text with quite interesting remarks, contextualizing the project of writing this story. So this story is embedded into his own introduction, and not only that, his voice somehow overlapping the narrator's voice time and again surfaces, trying to communicate his readers. Yes, if time permits, we shall meet it again. So during this cooperation with William Logan and his career, administrative career in this city of Calicut, Chandravanan had exposure to British novels, English novels, Elizabethan novels. And as he says himself in the introduction, he used to entertain within the household to which he belonged, the Nayars are matrilineal households. He used to enjoy something like regular meeting of the family, during which the family listened to stories. Yeah, somebody was telling the story and others were listening to the stories. And he tried to account for the things that he read in English, this novel was in English, to the family. The family liked it very much, enjoyed it very much, and asked him to translate something like that into Malayalam. Yes? And he tried, actually, he failed, and that came up with the idea that maybe he would write himself something like this English novel he happened to have read. And as he says in his introduction, it took fire immediately, and he wrote the thing within 6 weeks. This is in contemporary printing edition, in the translation version in English, is something like 250 pages. In original Malayalam format is not very big, like A5 more or less, it's usually more, even 500 pages. So within 2 weeks, within 6 weeks, and he said that if not, he had to wait for some books to be brought by sea from Mumbai. It would have been faster than that. So the subtitle of this first edition, and the second is a little bit different, is English novel Material Katha. And what we met time and again within the story, in this voice of the narrator, perhaps the author too, but the two voices sometimes bifurcate, is somehow correlated with terms he uses, like Kalakatha, a false story, and Salkatha, which is of course Satkatha, true story, real story, something like that. And in the introduction to specifically one chapter, which is going to introduce a character known mostly by the nickname Surinambudir Bade, namely rich and powerful Brahmana of the Nambudiri variety, representing the landed gentry, actually. That's the image of those people at that time. So this character is going to be mocked with no mercy. So he somehow feels it dangerous to be left without an introduction. So he introduces his readers. But saying like that, more or less, we have no time to look at the text. Listen, this is a new kind of katha, narration. You will see here different castes and groups, like those that you might think that are most respectful, like Nambudiris. Do not think that what I am saying, how I am representing that this is what I think about them, because I know many respectful Nambudiris and also quite a number of stupid ones, just like in every other caste. Yes, and this motive comes time and again through the medium of this Kalakatha versus Satkatha, and this Sat and Sattukar in plural reappear several times too. So that's a reprint of this first translation into English by Duberg from 1890. I think that Chandramanan is represented here in the garb of reminding somehow the characters from the north, especially the socially reforming people from Bengal, and probably it's not without meaning, since in the contemporary situation, most of my Malayalam interlocutors said, okay, come on, this is a socially reforming novel, don't represent it as something else. But actually, the novel is somehow cut into two parts. The first one has not much to do with social reforms. It's true that the main protagonist goes for a huge journey, which is going to change his life, just like in the Bildungsroman, and he comes back quite different. And during this journey, he is exposed to these new ideas. Chandramanan was mesmerized with railways, and because railways figure in this novel as a sort of a quasi character, at least at the first part, the second part too, in many ways. So this is how it looked in the 1893. That means 4 years after the publishing of Indulekha. So this line, Calicut Madras, which is essential for the novel, because the novel is full of historical name places and historical names of the families. We have, for those of you who is closer to this region, we meet with the names like Kilmanga, and many other historical names for the characters that appear in the novel. So this line is over there, and the value of the novel is probably somewhere to the south of this red line here, where the railway line from Calicut to Marva Streets turn left. This is at least how I see it. The Calicut station was opened in 1881, so just a year before publication of Indulekha. So it's not possible that Chandramanan could not have noted this thing. One more thing connecting to the print, and this print will emerge in the story itself, is Higginbotham's bookstore that started operation in 1844. Of course, this is not the historical picture, this is the more modern picture, and but this is the official date given by historians for Higginbotham's. But maybe this is not that much interesting, as Higginbotham's people, they knew, they came up with a clever idea that books could be sold in the railways. Yeah, so they established these bookstores in the railway stations, and there was a magnificent idea that is working to an extent even up here today. Yes, the protagonists of this book massively read, and they use books. So that's why I'm saying that they use printed books. Who are the dramatists and so on? Of course, Indulekha, a beautiful 18 years old at that time lady, educated, emancipated. Some people do not believe that it is possibly a historical situation. She belongs to matrilineal joint family household of the Naya, but Upper Naya provenance. They could have a house like that. We don't have, of course, a picture of the house. So this is a color picture. Madhavan had beloved cousin, actually. They are cousins. They are living in the same big compound, sort of a campus made of several buildings. Is her cousin. Distant enough to be acceptable as a party for her. They fall in love immediately. This is how the book starts. They fall in love, and they love each other. They not always they don't always are ready to admit it officially. They look they use a peculiar medium, and I will say something about that a little bit earlier. There are many protagonists here, many characters here. Except for these two, which are the main characters. The important one is Fatima, who is a Karanavan, the most important man for the joint family house, who in a matrilineal house, being a male, represents this huge economic unit of this huge house as one who takes decisions. But women are in the background. Yes, they accept these things or don't, I don't know. There is one more, Shankara Shastri. By the name we know that he's a Brahmana, but he's not a Nambudiri Brahmana. He's a so-called Bhakta, how the Nambudiris usually address the Tamil Brahmins. Shade of Suri Nambudiri, which is this Suri Nambudiri, this one, is this powerful, rich Nambudiri Pada, again, official Nambudiris, who appears on the scene, so to say, being invited by Panchamanan himself, who does not like Madhavan, because the young Madhavan, who is also an educated person, does not respect as much the elders as Panchamanan would like it to be. And among others, demands from Panchamanan, who is the head of the family, a decision to finance the study of one of the youngsters who lives in the compound. Panchamanan refuses, and there is a quarrel, and there is a curse, of course. Most prolific cultural machine for moving things forward in this part of the universe, the curse, as we know very well. There's a Govindan who is a shade to Suri Nambudiri, a man who is actually behind the plot of everything. And the other Nambudiris and the partners and travelers is full of charm. There are, of course, railways, books, networks of communication. And there is an affluent household campus named Puvalli. It is a longer name here. Unmentioned. How could Indulekha look like? These are historical pictures about the same moment. Of course, she could look like. No, right? These are pictures taken in studios at that time, so they are post pictures, not natural. And this one, which comes from Russian publications from 1980, showing someone, I mean, that's not my judgment, this is in this publication, a student at Madras University, circa 1905, this Kuduma, somehow attached to the wall. I asked many people, maybe so that you might offer your explanation whether it is for the sake of fashion, or sometimes they say, some other people say, no, this is to keep him awake to study without following this. Most of the editions, and the book made a career which is unbelievable. Somebody counted the number of editions towards the end of the 50s, as I remember, and already there was 50 plus editions. And whenever I happen to be over there, I'm looking for the editions of Indulekha. I've got a dozen at home. They have different covers, but most of them follow this logic to present Indulekha through their definition with Ravi Varma's paintings, who is said to take some inspiration from Indulekha himself. Whether it is true or not, I don't know. But this is the cover of the most recent translation to English by Anita Devasia from Kochi, and this is one of the paintings of the Ravi Varma. Another one, which is more important for this talk of mine, is the so-called reclining gradient, because one of the scenes in the Indulekha novel itself has Indulekha lying on a piece of furniture which is called kotchu. I mean, it's in locative, kotchu. It is probably coach. I can't remember, I can't imagine anything else. Just coach. There are many other English words incorporated in this world. She reads a book, or she reads books. She's rather rumored within the campus of this joint family household to be reading every day or every evening by the light of the kerosene lamp in the reclining position on this piece of furniture, which allows it. And this is how the two representatives of the elder generation, the previous world, namely this Karanavan, the head of the family, and his brother, how they find her. She's said to have her own maliga on the second floor of the building, and everybody sees in the evening where the sun sets down, the Indulekha lights her kerosene lamp. That's the signal that she's going to be reading, and after that she's going to be playing sitar, singing, and playing piano. So he was in many hearts. So this is how these two men find her. In a peculiar dialogue, anxious because they are asking her, what is she reading? And it proves that it is Shakuntalam. And Shakuntalam here is quoted several times, and it's quite extensive quotations. So it is Shakuntalam, because my first question was, well, maybe it is Malayalam Shakuntalam, maybe it is a Manipravalam Shakuntalam, which we know that more or less, but rather later time appeared on the market, so to say, but it must be at that time Sanskrit Shakuntalam, the more so that it's quoted in Sanskrit in Malayalam script. Now the question is, well, how it is possible? Did she have any chance to have a Malayalam script Shakuntalam to be reading? Probably not. I tried to follow this idea, but before I show it to you, this is a peculiar dialogue here, one of several, when Karanavan enters her room with his, now with the father of daughter, and they are actually speaking among themselves, saying what are the I mean, addressing the younger generation, specifically Indulekha and her lover, saying, can they read Ramayana or Bhagavatam or anything else similar? Why? There are so many volumes of, this is not my translation, literature. Literature is translated as Shastra, the peculiar way of Shastra, because they say that there are many things to be read now as Shastra. Shastra, and what is it? They name just two, Ramayana and Bhagavatam, but they add Mattu, so something else too, yes?
I think it means handwritten manuscript, Granthangal, so to speak.
Yes, most probably. This is one thing, and another thing is what they contain, actually, yes? And they say we continue like that. There are many volumes of this Shastram at Puvalli, which is the name of this household. No one touches them. They remain forgotten. She is contemptuous of Alekham. This is this expression, Alekham volumes. Do you think these people will touch anything other than printed books? What else can one say? I mean, this is the Kali. This is the new world that comes, which favors printed books. Indulekha is reading Shakuntalam not from an Alekha volume, but from a printed book. And we know it from another dialogue, which is on page 106. Don't have time to magnify it if somebody is interested, maybe later. This is page number 106 from the first edition, which is to the left. The dialogue goes like that. If Panchumanan, again, this elderly head of the family, entering her room because they had already plans to convince Indulekha to enter the relationship called Sambandham, which in the customary relationship somehow acknowledged in this region is a form of a quasi-marriage that acknowledges the relationship between the members of the Nambudiri Brahmin group and the members of the not only Nayar groups, but groups that Nambudiris name children. Yeah? Because this is their ideology, it's nothing real. So they already with this plan in their heads enter her room, but she is reading. That has made it. So Panchumanan is asking to Indulekha, is it that false book that you are reading? And false is Kalla. This Kalla, he actually says his Kalla Katha. Is it one of these Kalla Kathas that you are speaking to me, not telling me that you are now reading? She says, no, this is Shakuntala. Shakuntala is not Kalla in that sense. So, but she adds, the print in this book is very bad. It is difficult to read. This is a nice piece of evidence that print revolution was not what we usually take for granted, that print makes things clearer, that stabilizes the text, nothing of the kind. Most of these editions of Indulekha, modern and earlier, differ a lot, yes? Like the whole chapters, sometimes order is distorted, no stability anymore. So this is a printed Shakuntala. Why? She complains, it's difficult to read. Then Panchumanan, who is from this older world, asks, why don't you buy a better book? Where will you get it? He immediately says that I would give you the money. Yes, he is the money person. But Indulekha says, I don't know if a good print of this book is available. I will find out and let you know. Well, and to that, Panchumanan says, you should get one in large print. And for this large print is his aksharas. That's what he understands as print, and I mean that's the term here used, and this is not without consequences. So we see a while later. To that, Indulekha, smiling, says, "Isn't that difficult? It will cost a lot of money, because Panchumanan thinks that a printed book can be copied just like a manuscript." Yes, so he's like, "I'll give you money, get another better copy." This is the word. This is the situation in the world of manuscripts. Your copy is bad. Take another copies. You have money. Just order a copy. But if he does not know that printing is a different kind of project. We can not print one copy. Yes. So Indulekha is smiling. Yes. Isn't that difficult? It will cost a lot of money. She means an addition, printed edition. I do not even know if this book is available even in large print. That means that Indulekha printed Sanskrit version at that time was present there. She could have access to that, but the print was not of very good quality. And Panchumanan asked, what is it that you don't know? And Indulekha says, big time for printing. And again, she says, Aksharangal, she does not know because she knows that that's not the mechanism for getting the better edition of your printing book. It has to be on the market, yes, simply. So, total misunderstanding. There are two different separate words, yes, one thinking one set of preconceptions, the other with another. Okay, so that's what could she be actually reading? Yeah, I mean, of course, well, very well that the first translations appeared already in by the end of the 18th century, soon repeated and then in other languages. But what about Sanskrit Devanagari? Probably she must have been reading Devanagari. Probably what Chandu meant in his mind that his protagonist in the Lekha was to read Devanagari Shakuntala. But what was on offer there? Vigneta Shakuntala from Vinaya Saga Press 1883. Quite good print, but it was a scholarly edition with a lot of commentaries. The same thing with Vigneta Shakuntala from Calcutta, 1878, so it is still within the frame of probability where they could have access to that. And then we have Vigneta Shakuntala from Calcutta, so-called Crown Press, very bad. This is not a Photoshop blurry. Well, bad edition, I mean bad thing. Yes, so it could be that, of course. I'm not saying here that this is the copy that this is the edition that Indulekha actually read. So if the main protagonist could look like that, and if they were lovers, how did they express their feeling? Through Sanskrit. I mean, the most about love they are to say in this novel is not Malayalam, Sanskrit. But then I'm asking myself, so what about this mass appeal of this printing business? To whom? If this is a novel about love, and very much it is, and the targeted readers and the targeted readers are about to understand it, they need to know Sanskrit. So how many people could do that at that time? Probably not many, or things they do different that we think they need. This first edition itself is very much two. All right, so I try my best. There is a shapatam here, sort of curse and a vow at the same time, spoken by this head of the family as a reaction to this young man not showing enough respect to him, I mean, enough as he understands. And he repeats this shapatam twice, and this is the stronger time when he takes the witness of the Portal Bhagavat. So she is the witness of this shapatam. So this is a serious business. Yes, once he said that, once he let it slip from his mouth, this is a thing that set in motion all the events. It is quite, I find it quite peculiar that it is of course in an act of anger, this anger, and he's shouting, Asattukal, Asattukal, Sakalam Asattukal Artuvettanam. So you are, it's quite clear, you are untrue. All of them are untrue. You are irreal. I'm tempted to say you are fictional. Not real. That's Asattukal. He's repeated several times. This population. So there is a shapam, and this shapam triggers all the events. What are these events? That Rich Nambudri comes to marry Indulekha, but he does not want him. She makes fun of him and ridicules him, so he loses his honor, he loses his face, and finds himself in a situation that he cannot do. He cannot come back to his manor house without doing something. And then this shadow figure emerges and says to him, look, there is one thing we can do. If we arrange a sambandham, that is the marriage, this very night when the dialogue takes place, but not with Indulekha, but with her servants, with her servant, a very nice woman, then in the morning we shall spread the news that in the palanquin that we are taking the girl to our house, it is Indulekha, not a servant of him. How is that possible? We may ask him. But this clever guy knows how the media works in this environment. So he says to him that it is enough that in the temple, by the temple, there is a matram. It's a rich family. They have a matram, a place where Brahmin stays. If you distribute dakshina to all the Brahmins that are there, they will immediately spread. This is ironic in itself, that the Brahmins are just waiting for production of gifts, and they immediately spread. They will use the means of communication, train included, and spread the news that the rich Nambudiri took for some bandam in Lekha, by actually taking another one. How it is possible that to work? We have no time, but if the Tarab looks like that, if you don't draw a map, what is the distance to the railway, and how it looks like you are lost, you don't know how it is possible. But if you draw that map like that, you have this big Taravadu and the separate building in which the Karanavan and Indulekha used to live within the same compound. And then there is a Kshetram, namely the temple, by the temple a Kulam, a pond, a Kuripuram, male and female, and there is a Satrashala and the Matra. So that means that they finance and patronize huge number. He gave away dakshinas to 200 Brahmins. These Brahmins, one by one, traveled to the railway station, but the railway station was distant more for one walking project, so they have to spend the night in between. And this household patronizes two different caravanserais, so to say. One is called Intupunya, is rather for Brahmins, another one is called Satu. And several times in this plot, these people travel and they have no other chance to get the train, but to spend the night there. This is crucial for this development of these events, because when the palanquin with this freshly married quasi in the Lekha, but actually her servant, passes in the morning, they meet here all these 200 Brahmins who are there, and they spread the news. The palanquin is closed, they cannot see who is inside, so they say that it's in the Lekha. And all these Brahmins, they disperse, and it is clearly said that they are not Brahmins in terms of any temple business, they are just businessmen doing all sorts of transactions with their what they have. I'm finishing. So Kala Kata, how it finishes? What is the end? That is quite peculiar. Here, the Karanavan, the head of this huge house compound, is somehow touched by remorses, especially so that when Madhavan goes for his faraway journey to the north, there are news coming back that there's something bad happening to him, like an accident, and Indulekha has a dream, and in this dream he dreams that something really fatal happened to her lover, and she produces a binding statement. She says that she will not eat, she will not sleep until her love comes back house. And actually she shows herself to be slender and slender day by day, and this head of the house thinks that something is wrong, maybe that he's maybe he's to blame, namely his curse, yes? So he takes an advice of his Purohita, who is not a Nambudiri, who is a Vadya, namely one of the Patarsa, and the Vadya says, well, there's no other way, but you have to create as many Akshara Pratimas as your Shapatran was made of in terms of syllables, Aksharas. And there's a peculiar quarrel because Chandumanan, who is Panchumanan, the head of the family, who is known to be a stingy person, he asks, well, what about the endings, case endings? Are they also count? Do they also count as aksharas? And the Brahmin says, yes, yes, absolutely. And here you can see how the editors distribute this Chapatam into aksharas, And from edition to edition, it differs. Yeah? It's like here, the car taking as one akshara, and another edition, you have to this as two aksharas. Not the number comes to the same, it's 29. So this is the prayashchita. And there's a negotiation. The Panchamanan tries to negotiate maybe out of silver, but no, they have to be gold. They have to be gold, and they have to be given to the Brahmanas. And this is how it happens. Chandramanan, I think it is also meaningful, sees. I mean, the voice of the narrator says not that things are like that. It's just that Chandramanan sees that Indulekha gets better after this prayashchita. So he knows that the things got back on the right track through his akshara pratima dana. But the reader knows, and the other characters know, that the Madhavan is already on the way back because his father and his brother on his expedition of taking back actually already found him, and he's just expected to come back. So he's getting better by that, not by this prayashta. So, and this is a sort of like melancholical image just at the end. Yes, it's it the bitter irony is that the parody. I would rather take it as. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you.